hosted at the Institute of Classical Philology of Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. And this meeting is being streamed right now on our YouTube channel, and it will be recorded and available afterwards. And yeah, I generally the idea of having this conversation was spurred by the fact that two translations of Hercules Furens appeared uncoordinated, but the same spring. So Daną Gioia's English translation and my own Polish translation, first since the 17th century. So I invited Jaspreet Singh Boparai, who is a graduate of classics from Cambridge, and Jaspreet has PhD in Neo-Latin literature from Cambridge, and he's also a historian of art and a great lover of literature. So I invited Jaspreet to sort of lead this conversation about translating Seneca. So Jaspreet, I will give you the floor, and we can continue from there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. What I'd like to begin with is the simplest question, which is why both of you chose to translate one Seneca and two this particular play, because it's, well, obviously Seneca only composed sort of 10 tragedies or 9, and it's an interesting range of work, and of course, perhaps since the 19th century, there's been a lot of criticism of Seneca's tragedies as unperformable, in bad taste, and other similar censures, which don't necessarily seem to hold water. I wonder if we could talk first about why, in particular, Seneca's tragedies, and why this one, as something that both of you, by wonderful coincidence, managed to come out with in the same month.
Excuse me for butting in just briefly about the structure of the meeting. So until 8 o'clock or 11 in California, I guess we can have a conversation between Daną and myself and Jaspreet, and then we would very much like other people to join in the discussion. Okay, so just organization stuff. Sorry for butting in.
Yes, but so the simple question is, why Seneca and why Hercules Furens?
Who would you like to begin?
Why don't you begin, since you've asked? Who would you like to begin?
Well, why Seneca was because, I'm a poet and I've been fascinated with poetic tragedy. And from the first time I read some of Seneca in translation, I was fascinated by the plays, and I was puzzled that no one had translated these as poetic works. Really, it's been twice in the history of the English language. And for 100 years, there was, since there was a kind of academic verse translation. So the idea of trying to bring Seneca alive into English was fascinating. And there were two plays that interested me. The two plays that fascinated me, the and Hercules Furens. The thing that I liked about Hercules Furens was the third act, which was the descent into the underworld, which is Theseus's account of of Hercules rescuing him from the underworld, which struck me as the missing piece between Virgil and Dante. Also, this was the play that, for whatever reasons, most interested T.S. Eliot. So that was why I chose that particular play.
Okay.
So well, that's the first point we will differ, I guess, because I didn't translate Hercules Furens because I'm a poet. But coming from a completely different place, that of a professional classicist, professor, and I mean, at this point, when I started to work on Hercules, I was after my habilitation, degree, and I was also in training for being a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. So I wanted to find some way to combine my knowledge of psychoanalysis and my clinical experience with my understanding of literature. And it was, of course, an experiment, as every attempt to apply psychoanalysis to literature. And so I published a couple of articles on first Greek tragedy, because I started from Euripides, and especially Euripides' Hercules interested me. So it wasn't Seneca at this point. I was interested in madness in Euripidean tragedy, and I realized that what's interesting about Euripides' Hercules is that not only it's about madness, the very tragedy is completely mad in terms of it's the lack of structure, its chaotic composition. So Hercules, Euripidean Hercules, is disjointed, it's incoherent, it's very weird. And then I read Seneca's Hercules, which was completely different. It was this almost the same story, but depicted in a different way, very organized, very well-structured way. So I just started to think about the psychology of literary composition, so to speak, why the same theme can be presented first as chaotic and psychotic, and then as almost obsessively structured. And I came up with an interpretation that, in fact, the madness of Seneca's Hercules was a very different kind than madness of Euripides' Hercules. So, and in the process, I realized there is no Polish translation yet. There were two tragedies of Seneca translated by Elżbieta Wesołowska, who is present here with us. She translated Medea and Agamemnon and Octavia, so three, and but Hercules wasn't translated, so I started to work on this.
We add, two things is that, first of all, Octavia was a fascinating play, and I would have loved to have worked on it, but it didn't have the poetic bravura that Hercules did. But one of the other things I liked about Hercules Furens is something that the critics and scholars often identify as a problem, as a fault, and that is that the first act is a single monologue by the goddess Juno, who never reappears in the play again. And both in production and in analysis of the play, that's a kind of a curious thing that you give the whole first act to a major character who then disappears. I liked that. I liked the fact that she came out, she overwhelms the audience, and she, as they say in English, chews the scenery, and dominates the stage. And in fact, after my play was staged, I liked the actress who did that so much, is that when I was invited for readings, I would split my fee with her, and I would read some poems. I would have her come out and just do her stuff, and then I would read some more poems. And it absolutely works as a piece of theatrical poetry.
Can you tell us more about this staging? When did it happen? Because that's very interesting. And what was your experiences? Were you a director of this?
I was an unofficial director. I was working on the first version of this play. It was about 20 years ago in New York, and there was a fellow who wanted to produce plays, and these were in Soho. I mean, very off Broadway. And when he was doing this, he said, "Would you like to? What about staging it?" And I said, "I'd love to stage it." And so we together put it on, and he created a company which then lasted for 2 decades, called Verse Theater Manhattan. And so when we put it on, I said, we have to do it the way that I imagine it was done with Seneca. It's not realistic. Characters come out onto the stage and basically they do poetic oration. It needs to be very stylized, and it has to be about two things. It has to be about the poetry of the language and the dramatic personality of the actors. And it was enormously successful. The audiences, now these were very much lower Manhattan artistic bohemians. They loved it, and they responded to the stylization, and they sat there and had great oceans of poetic language put on them, and it was very moving. You could see the Aristotelian purgation happen. They were, as the play got darker and darker and darker, they had that kind of hypnotic horror that I believe Seneca did. So now, on the basis of that production, I even as going through, I repointed the language. We played the language with, I'd say, about 90% of the text, which is much more than you would do for Shakespeare. Shakespeare, that's probably do 2/3 of the text. So it was a long, wordy evening, and I felt vindicated by that. Then I took this actress to several other venues. The problem with the actress that I finally had to stop bringing her is that she would do this mad, murderous, poisonous, toxic, great poetry that Juno did. And after the end of the reading, women would come up to me and say, she was very right. She was absolutely right. And you go, no, she was evil. But it shows you how powerful Seneca was. I mean, they went on Juno's side. Which is, more morally appalling. Of course, everything in this play is morally appalling. But it worked. So it vindicated. So then, when as I rewrote it and I reworked on it, I had the advantage of actually seeing it in live time in front of a live audience for several evenings.
Well, that's fascinating, because of course there was and still is this whole debate about whether Seneca was ever staged in antiquity and where his tragedies meant to be performed. So famously, T.S. Eliot, whom you brought at the beginning, so in his essay, he said that obviously that this couldn't have been staged for various reasons. For instance, a kind of hilarious point he makes is that while Hercules appears and goes to murder Lycus and punish him, his father Amphitryo says to Theseus, "Okay, so while he's doing that, why don't you tell us about your adventures in the underworld?" So the audience sort of forgets about the horrific act that is being committed by Hercules, even though it was it was an act of justice in a way, but the whole plot, the whole development of plot is stopped suddenly, and we are invited to be immersed in this story about the descent into hell. So the first impression of scholars was that it couldn't have been staged, but recently some scholars suggested that we don't know, but it was at least possible that it was performed in some way.
Well, as the only non-scholar in the room, in the virtual room of Zoom, I'd like to say it strikes me as ridiculous to assume that these plays were not staged. I mean, it staggers my artistic imagination. Here's what I'll say. We don't have any documentation. No one has ever been able to find a program for a Seneca play from ancient Rome, and I regret that we don't have a playbill. But what do we know about the Romans? They loved spectacle. They had gladiatorial games. They had dances. They had singing competitions. They had chariot races. We know Rome was full of theaters. Now, what went on in those theaters was very many things, and the Romans had this innate love of spectacle. These plays are spectacular. What they resemble if you take the Western canon, they don't resemble Greek drama as much as they resemble Baroque opera. And I think that they were done very much like that, highly stylized. Another clue is that these plays contain special effects. It is quite clear that when Hercules comes on dragging Cerberus, we know that Medea, exits on a chariot. I mean, these are absolutely Roman special effects. I mean, I can see them, the guys in the back room, lashing 3 dogs together and dragging them on this, these 3 unhappy dogs onto the stage, and the audience, howling. But so it seems to me that unless you can prove to the contrary, one should assume that a play was played. The main objection that I see scholars making is that the plays are so rhetorical and so wordy. But I go back into the English tradition. The single play that created great Elizabethan drama was by Christopher Marlowe. It is called Tamerlane. It's about Timur the Terrible, Timur the Great, who conquers all of Asia. This play is so Senecan that it could have been written by Lucius Annaeus. It consists of Tamerlane coming on the stage, killing some king in about 3 lines, and then giving a great oration. And it's one great oration after the other, and the other characters come and give great orations. This play set the Elizabethan audience on fire. They played it again and again and again. Young Shakespeare saw it and said, wow, this is where poetry enters drama. So I think that for pre-modern audiences that were dramatic audiences before realism, they loved oration. And we know that Romans loved oration. They would listen to speeches for hours. So,
yes, that's.
I just don't see this being a chamber drama. I really don't.
I think it's a very good point about rhetoric. So we live in a culture which is completely detached from rhetoric as it existed in antiquity, and it was later people tried to reproduce it in some way in early modern period. And I also like your point about opera, because when you look at the development of Italian and French opera, you can see a sort of the tension between the attempt to make it as little rhetoric as possible and to make it dramatic, like in Florence first and Venice later. So no arias, but those long recitativos, which were of course very rhetorical, and the emphasis was on the action on stage. But then later in Italy, opera went towards something much more virtuoso and sort of, so which again was criticized for being empty, and in the first half of 20th century no one could believe that anyone could listen to 17th century Italian opera without falling asleep. But now when you look at great opera houses, they all produce Cavalli and then Scarlatti and Hasse and all of the great
and Handel
opera, and people love it. People don't fall asleep.
Well, I think we're in an odd position. You take the most sophisticated English-speaking audience, theatrical people, literate people, they cannot endure a Shakespeare production that doesn't cut half the text. And I think it's because we're at television and movies and, in the acceleration of our culture. That is not a good, a reliable judge of how earlier ages judged language. In America, when Abraham Lincoln did his famous debates with Stephen Douglas, they would talk in a systematic way for 4 hours. And the audience, be huge crowds of working people that followed it. And so it was a very different relationship to language. And I think that we have to sort of make that historical leap into the sensibilities of the ancient world, which was still largely an oral culture.
Yeah, and actually, I have to admit that in Poznan we also staged Seneca some years ago. It wasn't Hercules Furens, but it was Medea, and there were some cuts made. It was made by our students' theater called Singh, and the theater our troupe performed Medea, and I was asked to write some music because I'm a musician, apart from being classicist. So I don't think music was great, but I think it did a trick in terms of adding this operatic quality to the play. But I can't say if people enjoyed this play because I was a part of making it, but they didn't boo us, at least. So I think it was well received. Maybe in the Q&A there will be some memories shared about this. It was, I don't know, over 10 years ago, I'm sure.
In New York, I was lucky because New York is full of, if not unemployed, underemployed actors. And so, for something that was only going to run for for a couple of performances, I was able to get fantastic actors. And, I think that really helped. I don't think, Seneca's work was done by amateurs, which is what would be the case if it was a chamber drama. The various society ladies and men would act out the parts as they did in Elizabethan England. So I don't know. I think it was Baroque opera. I think it was Elizabethan drama. I think it was Roman Colosseum level, noise, when they're doing these blood and thunder.
Oh, well, yeah, and I think it would be interesting as well to discuss how we understand the play, because I think it's very rich in terms of its meaning. So I'm a bit curious how Dana feels about the meanings of the play.
Well, I'm sure this was the same experience for you. As I began the play, I thought of it very differently than when I did by the time I ended the play. And when I first saw the play on the stage, it taught me things about the play that I was then able to work into the revision of the translation. And I've come to a conclusion very much like what I assume is yours, that this is a deeply psychoanalytic play. And in fact, I was talking to one of my sons about who was doing something in his life. I won't talk about it. I said, but said if you immerse yourself in the darker things, they stain you. You cannot go to the underworld and come back untainted. And I think that's in some ways what it is. If you descend into violence, if you descend into all of these forbidden things, which is I think a metaphor for the id, for the darker elements of human nature, you cannot control them in the world of daylight, because the darkness knows truths that the daylight cannot afford to acknowledge. So anyway, I became very interested in the psychoanalytic. Also, I would guess the kind of the mythic elements, not mythic in terms of the gods, but mythic in terms of all of these early ritual taboos and protections. The religious sense of the play in the sense of these the original tribal Roman religions, I think, is very strong, that there are certain taboos that you cannot break. And ultimately, having broken a certain set of taboos, Hercules breaks the fundamental taboo. You don't kill your own family. And so at the end of it, the only thing that I cannot quite accept is the last few lines of the poem. He says, well, okay, you've killed your family, you've done all these things, let's go off to Thebes and start over, because that's where people learn forgiveness. And I translated the lines, but I entirely believed the poem, the play, until the last maybe 20 lines. I don't know about you, but I don't think redemption, forgiveness, is quite that easy. But until then, I mean, it is a, but he's got to get this guy off stage somehow, so, he ends with with a smile on his face in a weird way.
Yeah,
I can see Theseus saying that. I can see Hercules wanting to believe it, but I cannot see the audience believing that. But until then, the other 99% of the play, I think, is pretty convincing in psychological terms.
I'm very pleased that you said this because that also struck me and led me to my attempt at a psychological interpretation of more of the play as a whole than of any of the figures, because I don't think we can psychoanalyze literary figures because they are not real people. I think we can psychoanalyze the mind behind the play. So I looked at the play as a whole, as it were a human psyche. So all the protagonists and all the places I took to mean some part of human soul, and so I realized that it's a story about someone who wants to become more than human. He wants to become omnipotent. So he wants to conquer the earth first. Then he wants to conquer hell, and then he wants to conquer heaven. So he wants to have absolute power, which no human can have. So it's a narcissistic fantasy of absolute control over everything, and it ends horribly because the destructive part of psyche, which I think is represented by Juno, the destructive part is wreaking havoc because of that. So I took Juno and then Hercules as being like two sides of this extremely aggressive, violent part of our soul, and then I took the underworld to mean this darkest place, barren, lifeless. Seneca has this marvelous line that the land of the dead is the land of death is worse than death itself, right? So this is a horrible place where nothing happens, emptiness, nothingness, barrenness. And of course, heaven represents some transcended realm, and Megara and Amphitryon represent normal human figures. So you have all the universe of human psychology in it. So I thought the structure of the play is so coherent because it's a pathological coherence. It's an attempt to create a fake coherence to this extremely chaotic, violent inner world. And the main difference between Seneca and Euripides that I think exists is that in Euripides you have real forgiveness. So in Euripides, in this mad play, Hercules goes through a process of mourning. So he is transformed through the help of Theseus. So the power of friendship is therapeutic for Hercules. So we believe that when he goes to Athens, his therapy continues. But Seneca, and I think it's deliberate, he shows a fake resolution, because Hercules, to the very end, he is so megalomaniac. He says, well, I want to kill myself. This will be the grandest suicide in all history. I have to be crushed by all the mountains, and all the forests have to be cut down because this will be the only pyre worthy of myself. So his megalomania doesn't end. It's right to the end. So I totally agree with you, Dana, that there is no forgiveness. That there is this horrible ending, which is, for me, it's absolutely horrifying.
Well, I want to make two comments. One intellectual and one maybe stupid. I believe that this is really a product of imperial Rome when the country has gone bad. Seneca has seen hundreds, thousands of people killed, arrested, tortured, forced into suicide with no retribution, no justice. And I think that that political vision permeates this play. You don't have Athenian hopefulness. You don't have Athenian democracy, playing this. And I assume the audience that saw this was not the audience of the Colosseum, but it was a relatively aristocratic patrician audience, in these theaters, because I imagine it was like opera. It was an expensive production, and I think they share this sense of they're living in a time where violence is pervasive, the state is violent, and there's no recourse. And so, I don't think he believes in redemption at the end. I mean, I think it'd be very interesting to do a Catholic reading of Hercules Furens, which is, here is the tragic human situation from which there is no escape. There's no Deus ex machina, in this play. The second thing I want to point out, and it's about what you're saying, is that I think Juno is the first super villain, in drama here. She comes on, and if you think of all, American films, somebody is a villain. How? They are the best spoken person in the play. They usually have a British accent, but if someone comes on and speaks in complete sentences in an American movie, that's going to be the villain. And so what you have Juno comes on, and she's the most eloquent person in the whole play. I mean, Theseus comes close to her, but it's a rival between her and Theseus, and she just dazzles you, which allows you to participate in her evil. But there's also an element in Juno, and this is why her curse works, is that she's also a psychoanalyst. She understands how to get into Hercules' psyche, both to make him crazy and also to give him the one punishment that will hurt the most. And so I think it's really quite interesting to look at Juno as this sort of evil psychoanalyst, this evil psychologist who has, as they say in English, psyched out, this fellow that's impossible to conquer. She spent her whole career trying to kill this guy, and she can't do it. And now she's come up with her big idea, which is to make him go crazy and punish himself, kill him, basically, destroy himself.
Yes, but you're right. She's using his personality. So for sometimes scholars interpreted Hercules' madness as something external, so just something inflicted upon him by the gods. But then some scholars started to point out that his madness comes from within. So Juno uses tendencies which already existed in Hercules: his pride, his aggressivity, his violence, his lack of empathy and humanness, and she just sets fire to this.
And that's why her one act long monologue is not a problem. It's necessary. She does three things. She tells you that Hercules cannot be conquered, and she gives this wonderful account of all the monsters he's fought. Now you gotta believe that Roman audiences loved that, in the same way that that they loved it in Ovid. They just loved having all these stories retold. Secondly, she tells you that he has broken the taboos. There's some taboos that are stronger than the gods themselves. Even the gods are not allowed to violate certain taboos. And Hercules has done it. He's gone into the underworld, and he's actually taken one of the creatures of the darkness and brought this creature to the light. We, in fact, see him do this. That's another reason why I think has to be staged. You have to see the weirdness of what he's doing. And the third thing she's saying is she's going to use the punishment of that taboo to make him crazy. So that monologue, which is brilliant and entertaining in itself, sets up the motivation, the method, and the action of the tragedy itself.
Yes, and I think your point about the political dimension is of course, undeniable. Obviously, imagine a powerful, narcissistic, grandiose tyrant who has a aggressive mother. Okay, rings a bell. Obviously,
well, but even before that, I mean, Caligula. I mean, Seneca was lucky to get banished from Caligula, but how many people did Caligula kill in his brief reign?
But I was thinking about Nero, actually.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah. The only difference, and maybe it's deliberate, is that it was Nero who tried to kill his mother twice, and he succeeded only the second time. And Seneca had to explain this to the Roman.
They had to be accomplices in this murder.
Yes, exactly. So so in the play, it's the other way around. It's the wicked mother or stepmother, actually, who makes Hercules, who brings the worst out of Hercules. But I think that there is a lot of things about tyranny said in the play. So one of the interesting points which go beyond this because it's a very narrow reading, so we can read the play through the lens of Nero's tyrannical personality and rule, but it's very narrow. But Seneca goes beyond that, because initially Lycus is the tyrant, and Hercules is the savior who is getting rid of the tyrant and bringing peace until Hercules becomes tyrant. So the point Seneca makes is that, which was of course already present in political philosophy to some degree, that if you use violence to get rid of evil, it gets back at you. So it's this vicious circle of violence. One tyrant, you have a revolution, and eventually you have another tyrant after the first one. So it goes beyond merely Nero and his times.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't read the play as a political allegory, but I think that the play comes out of a particularly sort of poisonous milieu of the decay of the Roman Imperium, of these series of mad, evil, incompetent emperors.
Yes, but
because if you think about this, I mean, who are the three emperors under whom the adult Seneca lived? Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. This is not the Roman Republic at its, in its early days. It's not even the imperial thing under its best emperors. So I mean, he would. It's like being. I mean, the person he reminds me of a Soviet writer. He's like Mandelstam or Akhmatova. That's the situation he's writing out of, and so I don't think he's doing an allegory of the political situation, but I think he's influenced by it. And he's found a story. I mean, it's the weird thing about translating this is, I mean, if you were going to sort of say who is the tragic hero you want to give words to, Medea, yeah, Agamemnon, yeah, Hippolyta, Phaedra, yeah, Hercules, no, I mean, Hercules is a brute with a club, and so it's a very odd. Because I mean, he's very eloquent, but he's also somebody that Seneca has to make sort of stupid at the same time. He's a stupid, brutal guy with a gift for language. But his gift for language, as you pointed out, is for exaggeration, for self-aggrandizement, for threat, and you just want to go up and just slap him, and say, pay attention to reality. But he's caught up in this myth of his own invincibility, which is precisely what Juno wants to destroy.
Earlier, you said that your understanding of the play evolved as you worked on it, and it happened to me in the same way. So I began with this psychological reading, of course, realizing that there are those political dimensions to it. But the more I worked on it, and of course. It took me some years to publish it, maybe not as long as you, but still, for me now this play is mostly about death, about human necessity to face death. So especially in choral odes, which are very different, because choral odes are not bombastic, they are not fake and empty or rhetorical like Hercules's speeches or Lycus's orations. So they are very tender. They are basically, choral odes represent humanness or humanity in the inhuman world. And of course, Amphitrio and Megara are also very human figures, but choral odes are so beautiful. And I came to appreciate them more and more in time. And the vision they propose is really painful, because it's a vision of inevitable death. So death devours everyone. We all have to die at some point, whether we are powerful or not powerful. And Seneca suggests that those who are the most powerful, they are also the most unhappy people. So death is for them the most difficult thing to bear. And so for me, this play is about death and about the rejection of death. So Hercules represents this fantasy that we can control reality. We can, which for me is very, very actual. I mean, the attempt, of course, we have technology. They didn't have. They had mythology, but we have technology. So we want to prolong life as long as it's possible. So we think it's an outrage if someone dies at 70, for instance, or we think it's an absolute outrage that people die. And there is something noble in it, right? A moral protest against death. But at the same time, I think we live in this profound denial of death. And of course, many people wrote about this. So this play shows the catastrophic consequences of trying to deny death. And instead of coming to terms with death, with the passing of time, our limits, it's this fantasy that we can somehow be gods, which ends, but we become devils if we want to.
And everything you've said, which I agree with, is an argument for Seneca's authorship. I mean, people that, the scholars that say, well, Seneca did not write these plays, that they're just ascribed to his name. There's stylistic things that you see. I mean, his use of maxims, these sententiae, that are in the plays. But I just finished rereading, as Jaspreet knows, I'm putting together a collection of Seneca's maxims, his aphorisms, which you can pull them from the plays and the prose, and they look, it's the same. You can hear the same voice, but most of Seneca's letters are about dealing with anxiety, especially the anxiety of your own death, the death of your family, the death of your friends, the shortness of life, and so these are. This is an imaginative response to the major issue that Seneca deals with as a Stoic. Is what is the productive and right human response to its own mortality. So, I think it's I think that perception. I guess as a poet, what interests me most about the play now is his depiction of the underworld, and the underworld being both mythic and psychological and personal. And I see this play being a missing piece in the Western canon. It's the missing piece between Virgil and Dante, which then reemerges in Romanticism and modernism. And I think that's what Eliot saw in this play. Is that this is another great mind, a great philosophical mind, who is meditating on the last things, as the Catholic Church calls it, the last things, death, judgment, heaven, or hell. And so I think, it's a fascinating play. Now, I had a personal reason in wanting to translate a verse tragedy, is that I wanted to do poetic theater. And so, by doing this play and trying to make everything work, I gave myself a kind of master class in theatrical verse. I want to say one thing about the choruses, because you've mentioned the choruses, and the choruses, I'm an amateur Latinist. The rest of you are professionals. It takes me 5 times as long to work on these things as it probably does you. But, I find Seneca's Latin, especially in some of the choruses, extremely difficult. It's highly elusive language. And and if you look at the scholarly notes, he's evoking Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides. These are very much like T.S. Eliot. He's bringing other texts into it that are echoing. And so when I translated the plays, into iambic pentameter, blank verse, as they say in English. A 10-syllable line. It's the standard line of poetic drama in English. But each of the choruses I translated into a different meter, and they were rhymed. Because I think that when Seneca was doing the choruses, they're show-off pieces. Seneca is saying, look how good my choruses are. Look how learned they are. How, and each of them is quite different from the others. I mean, the first of the choruses is right out of Horace. It's the golden mean. It's leading the life in the country where you're content with your lot and not trying to go off and fight fate. And then suddenly, and so the choruses quite naturally, I think in all of them, they reflect the drama around it, and the choruses get darker and darker as the play proceeds. And so what I did, and highly subjective thing, but I think it helped, is I took each of the choruses and I did it in the meter of a great English poem. And when so that you hear, I'm not imitating the poem, but I'm imitating the sound of the poem. So when it comes on, you hear something. You hear the tradition behind it. And so finally, into one of the great ones, I used Milton's, one of John Milton's, greatest poems, Lycidas, this tremendous kind of pastoral elegy about death, which is a very heavy sound. But I found that was a way where I could evoke what I think of was some of the poetic weight of these very interesting choruses. But I found them extremely difficult. And there's one stanza in the second chorus that I don't think anybody has understood. I don't think any of the editions knows what's going on there. They know how to translate it word for word, but they don't really. So I finally said, I don't know what it is. Nobody can explain it, what it is. So I finally said, well, let me presume that this is going on so I can give it some narrative cohesive. This is where Hercules is going into the northern country to open up a port for trade. But it's a very bizarre stanza in the choruses. But anyway, I found them fascinating to work on.
Yeah, in terms of this allusive technique, that there's obviously a lot of allusions. I mean, the Juno character, that's an allusion to Virgil's Venus, which was, of course, easily readable to Roman audience, but also the description of the underworld. Seneca uses Virgil and Ovid's descriptions of the Golden Age, but turns them upside down. Yeah. So he takes the description of the Golden Age where you have this richness of earth, the Mother Earth gives birth to everything you need. And Seneca says, in the underworld, the earth is barren. There are no plants. So the rivers are poisonous. So this is the antithesis of the great Augustan poetic vision of the Golden Age. So there are a lot of allusions on the level of the use of words, use of images, which are taken from Virgil, from Ovid, from Horace.
And what's interesting is that he'll take something that in Homer, is 5 or 6 lines, or in Virgil is 10 lines, and he turns it into these great, they're positively modern, in their alienation, in their despair, and in their existential desperation, in these long things, which once again, I've got to believe it's, in your psychoanalytic view, this is Seneca projecting his own despair in some ways. As a philosopher, he has to always say that I control my despair. I'm very rational. I make all the right choices. But in the play, he can expose, I think, dark and uncontrollable things in his own psyche, because the plot resolves it. The plot externalizes it. But, this is Seneca when he's not all, buttoned up, as they say in English, And so anyway, I think, but one feels the emotional extremity of those great speeches that Theseus does in the third act about the barrenness, the bleakness, the unredeemable damnation of existing in this deadly dark world.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned an important thing which could spend another hour talking about, which we won't, about the relationship between Seneca Tragicus and Seneca Philosophus. So why this Stoic philosopher wrote such unstoic tragedies. But I want to go back to what you said about the difficulty of translating Seneca, because I think one thing you said, it's spot on. So the language is so condensed, so elusive and rich that you just, so first you have to, so I felt that every step I had to decide which meaning is dominant for a given passage, and I had to reject other layers and other meanings. But of course, I could be mistaken in my choice, or someone could see it differently. So the richness and the elusiveness makes it very difficult to translate. Another thing is that there are so many mythological, geographical, and historical allusions, which for modern readers are completely unintelligible. So the challenge is whether to get rid of all of them, which is not a good idea, or to retain all of them at a great cost. So I decided to retain the flavor. So if there is an allusion to some distant geographical place or some obscure myth which only scholars recognize, so I decided it has to be there. But of course, I couldn't reproduce all the details of those stories, which are sometimes very intricate. So you have those Baroque descriptions of mythology and geography, and then suddenly you have a sententia, which is so precise and condensed, so that the contrast between Seneca's ability to be very clear at one point, and at another point, he can ramble about, the Baltic Sea being frozen or something like that. So that's.
Well, no, it is. It's the density of allusion and reference is an issue, and which is, I think, also an issue in a number of Roman poets. But what I did is, I'll make these numbers up. If I had 10 references, I'd say, well, these two are not necessary. This one, just the sound of the place will work, but the rest of them I try to translate in a way which explained itself. If they have something, to explain that it was a river here or a plain there or this, and so I thought that there was the allusion often had to be translated in a way that explained its own meaning. And as you did the play in extenso, if you did this in the first and second acts, you'd find some of these things coming up in the third, fourth, and fifth acts, and by then you'd sort of explain what they were, And so I think that, but it was a real issue, and I had to do the translation in a way which made it as clear as possible. And so, if in the first act, when Juno is looking at the stars and pointing out that they're all the illegitimate children of Jupiter, every one of these constellations is a memorial of adultery, and so as I gave the name of the constellation Callisto or Taurus or Europa or the Pleiades, I would take Juno's description in a way that explained it. So even the zodiac has now become a pantheon of prostitutes and bastards. Look at Callisto shining in the north. That glittering slut now guides the Argive fleet. Or see how Taurus rises in the south, not only messenger of the spring's warm night, but the gross trophy of Europa's rape. And you'd go through it, so you'd add a little turn that explained it in case the modern audience didn't get it. And the fact is, Seneca lumps all of these prostitutes and bastards, in one passage. And once you sort of start that, the audience gets it. These are all the women that he seduced. These are his, his panderers. These are his illegitimate offspring. And so I think if you can create a self-explanatory context, it helps. But it's a huge issue. It's absolutely a huge issue in translating Seneca.
Now, before we go to the Q&A, I just want to say how much I like the fact that you translated this in verse, in blank verse. I mean, in Poland, we don't have this. So in Poland, usually classicists translate poetry as poetry, even though we usually don't use rhymes, but we use meter. And I think it's essential. I remember when last year Wolfgang de Mello, a scholar from Oxford, came here, and there was a discussion panel about how to translate Plautus comedies. And there was a question why de Mello translated this in prose, and he said, "This is for students." So the purpose is to help students to understand Latin text. But when you see English translations, they become predominantly prose translations, which has some advantages, of course. But I think it's very bold what you did, being a poet, that you try to do a poetic translation, which is very musical and very, very good. And I think it's a completely different thing to read an ancient poem in this kind of prose philological translation, and as an attempt at poetry in another language, even though, I mean, we are not poets like you are, but still it's worth trying to reproduce this poetic quality.
Well, my whole objective was, because there's a reliable prose translation that's 100 years old, my whole objective was to try to create a play which allowed an audience or a reader to experience Seneca as a poetic dramatist, as a tragedian in the great tradition. And I didn't cut a single line. I translated it faithfully, not necessarily word for word, but phrase by phrase, line by line. But I had to make every moment, I felt, work as poetry and work as drama. And that's why it's so damn long, and that's also why it was good to see it on stage. But anyway, I think you get a completely different sense of Seneca Tragicus if you can experience it as poetic drama, in the same way that we experience Shakespeare, we experience Marlowe, they experienced Sophocles, they experienced Euripides. Because otherwise, what you're giving is a bridge to the Latin. But American culture is largely Latinless right now. No one beyond maybe 1,000 people are going to read Seneca in Latin. So this was something to give the literary audience, a sense of what Seneca might have, not must have sounded like, but might have sounded like to a Roman audience.
Okay, so why don't we invite other people here to the conversation? We have 3 translators of Greek and Latin poetry among us, Eva, Elżbieta, and Krystyna. And so I think we can have a fairly spontaneous, I don't know, Jaspreet, what you think about it. We can have a fairly spontaneous conversation, unless...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think, although I'd like to jump in with a question first, because we've been talking a little bit about production. So in terms of our translations that we have, what would we envision as the music for these respective translations? It's a question that exercised me when I first read Dana's translation. What would where would the music come in a production, if there were any, and what would it be? And I'd like to ask the same about your translation, because I think it's an important element if this is going to be, if production is going to be more than merely a recitation.
Like all artistic questions, it depends upon the quality of your collaborators. If when I was in high school, I got a recording of a play by William Butler Yeats. You know, Yeats, the great Irish poet and dramatist who won the Nobel Prize, called The Only Jealousy of Emer. Very strange play, but it had music. And the reason actually I bought it as much for the music by an American composer named Lou Harrison, a disciple of Charles Ives, a kind of early advocate of world music. And he had music throughout. He had a song in it, and it all worked because you had a great composer, who spent some time and took it seriously. I mean, you could have drums. You know, if you don't have great things, you have drums, or you have fives. I think it's an open question how Romans recited or chanted or sang their lyric poetry. I think it's quite possible that Seneca envisioned his choruses to be sung. I don't know. I mean, we know that Greek dramatists not only sung but danced their choruses in the same way you would for a Broadway show. I mean, Athenian drama was a lot like Dancing with the Stars, an American Idol, or a Broadway musical. So what I would do is I think it would be interesting to do a production of this with a significant composer who created music all the way throughout, the way that Benjamin Britten did for W.H. Auden's plays. And I think it would be even interesting to try to set one or more, maybe certainly the first chorus. I think the first chorus lends itself to music because it's more or less one idea that's sustained. It doesn't have the big dramatic switches that the other choruses did. And C, but I think it would really depend on the caliber, of it. I mean, Philip Glass would create, one kind of score. I think Arvo Pärt would be an interesting person, to do something. I think Pärt could do something with the choruses. I don't know, but until then, I think it's get good actors and a good director. Jan Kant.
I don't think it's easy. I mean, maybe in America it's different, but I think it's quite difficult in Poland to get any theater really interested in ancient plays. But maybe Eva or Elżbieta have had different experiences. But is there a space for ancient plays on stage today?
Not in commercial theater. I mean, you're not going to get this on Broadway next to The Little Mermaid and The Lion King. It's just not going to happen. But New York and Los Angeles are two good places. Los Angeles has got 50,000 actors. There's 50,000 actors, most of whom aren't working. New York probably has 50,000 actors, most of whom aren't working. Now, they don't want to, go on a road show and give 6 months to Seneca, but you can find a theatrical space that's free for a week. You can find actors that want to keep, busy, and ancient drama is a prestige product. So Verse Theater Manhattan, after they did Hercules Furens, did Medea. And so, then they did, some Greek plays. And so I think it's in non-commercial, non-governmental theater. In America, most of the arts are still in this kind of non-profit private sector. They're done by individuals outside of, the marketplace, and they can raise the money to do it. So, I think I would like, before I die, to see it done again. But I give myself at least another 10 years, so I don't have to begin right away. But actors want to act. I mean, I couldn't believe the people that were willing to to be in this show, but they just wanted to be on stage. I mean, the Hercules. I mean, this fellow learned hundreds of lines by heart for 3 performances.
And there's a real technical challenge involved with this as well. If you look at Senecan drama in the Renaissance, the sheer amount of breath control you need to handle some of these very long periods, particularly in the French ones, is astounding. You have accounts of one actor in a play by Racine, which was quite a Senecan one. I think it was possibly Andromaque. Yes, in fact, it was. And he acted with such vigor that he gave himself a stroke. So that's perhaps not. I think technically his breathing control needs a bit of work. However,
does anyone of the audience have a question or a comment?
Yes, may I have a question? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
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 I must say that Seneca is not my cup of tea. I don't like him very much, but your discussion about Seneca was fascinating. And you, during the discussion, you had a very nice frame. You started from discussing problems connected with staging, and you finished with remarks on translating Seneca. And what came to my mind is a quotation from Hamlet. As far as I remember, Polonius says that instructing players at the Danish court that they play they should play Seneca not too heavy and Plautus not too light. Yeah. It is, of course, about staging. But my question is to both of you, what about your translations? Is your translation not too heavy in respect of comparison to the Latin original? What do you think? Could you express some thoughts about your own self-reflection on your translation in respect of this quotation from Hamlet?
Well, since my translation was poetic, the primary objective of each speech, each chorus, because you have this poetic moment, then you have these stage business, but each of the big scenes was to cast a spell on the audience in the way that poetry does, to create a kind of spell of sound, of image, which made them vulnerable to the mood of the speech. And so that the purpose of doing it really is to make Seneca's darkness and violence not simply bearable, but hypnotically fascinating. And I think that's so if it doesn't work, then what you hear is the rhetoric, what you hear is is this. But I think that there's not a lot of laughs in Hercules Furens. There's no comic moments. And so what you're really doing is different levels of seriousness. You've got Megara and Amphitryon, who are very reasonable people, very affectionate people. Lycus, who's the tyrant, is reasonably, he's a little unscrupulous, but he's a reasonable man. So you've got, try to make Lycus like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, our president, could come in and he can make a case for anything. Very down to earth, like, of course I got to do this, and so he sounds like a really successful politician. Now he's killed he's killed members of your family, but he's a very practical man and he wants to make a deal, like all politicians do. And so I have this world that's kind of the world of reasonable public affairs, and then I have these completely unreasonable characters, Hercules, Juno. And then I have this very problematic character who's Theseus, who's a reasonable guy, but he spent time in the underworld, and he needs therapy. He's deprocessing. When he's asked about his thing, he says, "I don't even want to talk about this. I really don't want to talk about this, but I have to respond to you." So what you've got in that third act, you could say, Mateusz would say, is it's a therapeutic session where he's processing all of these things that he witnessed in the underworld. So I tried to create a different level of language for those things and to cast a spell so you would be open to these very uncomfortable experiences. Because otherwise, Seneca is a bloody, horrifying drama.
Thank you.
So same thing with opera. I mean, opera, you're continually watching beautiful young women die on stage, and you're applauding, because when Mimi dies, when Violetta dies, when Tosca is about to kill herself, the composer puts us inside the emotions and the imagination of these prime donne, and you feel the extremes of what it is to be human. And that's what I think I was trying to do, is to bring the humanity back into Seneca.
And when my translation was also in verse, without rhyme, but with meter. And so this, of course, is experienced nowadays as somewhat heavier rather than lighter. But I think I tried to, maybe I even made it too light in certain ways, because I certainly avoided this. I didn't want the translation to be too bombastic and too rhetorical, because, well, of course, there is a scholarly introduction. Unlike, Dana also wrote a very interesting introductory essay, which is much better than the majority of scholarly work, I must say. But my introduction was a proper scholarly work on the play, and then I did references explaining a lot of details. So it's not a translation for so-called ordinary people, whoever they are. But I think if someone wants to just read it for pleasure, it's possible. So and you just have to avoid references and introduction and bibliography. So I tried to make it more accessible, maybe, than Seneca is in Latin. So my translation is not as learned and as sophisticated linguistically as Seneca. And sometimes, well, this is a very grim play. So I noticed something which, maybe I'm a bad person, but I attempted at making a joke occasionally. Maybe those are private jokes, so no one will probably notice them. For instance, I used, when Lycus talks about politics, for me, it was the same thing as for Dana. He's just a universal politician. So I used two slogans, one associated with the right and one associated with the left in Poland, and I put it inside my translation. I'm sure people from the right will see only the allusion to the left, and the left will see only the allusion to the right. But it was a private joke. I'm curious whether someone will notice it and email me about this, but maybe I shouldn't do it, because this is a very serious play. But I think it's very hard to bear as well.
Well, Lycus is not a very serious character. I mean, we've seen Lycus on television our whole lives. And so I felt the same way. Lycus was the lightest moment, because he's just coming on there. He's performed a successful coup. He's just tying up the ends of it. he's now, wants to, hey, I killed your family, but why don't you marry me?
Exactly.
I mean, it's only a politician. And Seneca's clearly met this guy again and again, as the consul or in the Senate. And so, yeah, I think you have to find. I have a couple private jokes, but that are in this. I felt, once again, Seneca is embedded in the tradition. So I took 2 lines. My play has been translated twice before in English, and I took a line from Jasper Haywood, that's 500 years old. So it was very hard to, and another line from the more recent translation, and I worked them into my translations. I did that as a kind of private homage, so that I know where they are. I don't think anybody else can find them. And then I worked a phrase from Eliot in, a phrase from Wallace Stevens in, phrase from Dante in, because Seneca was doing this with Sophocles, with Virgil, with Aeschylus. He's weaving them in. So as a homage to the previous translators, I incorporated them, and I'm hoping that in the underworld, when they read the book, they'll recognize it, and it gave me pleasure, to acknowledge the tradition, that had created this and had preserved it.
Maybe someone else has a comment or wants to ask a question. Jaspreet, yes.
Yes, only very small remark. Thank you for your conversation. Very, very interesting and deep. And I'd like to say as a simple addition about concerning the popularity of Seneca, its paradox in Poland, even now, but not as a playwright, but rather as a philosopher, but not in his whole frame, but as giving us the so-called sententia Senecane. We have in Poland or 20 years ago published the book How to Tame the Difficult Situation. Or it's about the public stoicism, and the book is full of the sententia from Seneca and Mark Aurelius, and this is one example. And the second one is before it was in our communism in Poland. It was a selection of Senecan proverb made by Professor Stróżyński.
It's 87. Sorry to interrupt you. It's 27, this volume.
Yes, thank you. And this book was waiting very long for publication. Professor Stróżyński told me it himself. He had many difficulties because it wasn't in the main trend of these times. But eventually, when it was published, it was a complete bestseller, and it was sold maybe in 2 weeks, as far as I remember. It was completely shocking. So I think it's our Polish element in his popularity even now.
Well, if I can add something to what Jaspreet said, there is in the United States right now, and this astonishes me, a huge movement among young men to read Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. It's this kind of modern, and it's full of websites and videos and things like this. And in fact, my translation, I think, is probably going to be entirely ignored by American classicists. But this group, and Jaspreet knows some of these people. A lot of them are people that did PhDs in classics and have ended up doing other things. And they have even have life coaches, Senecan life coaches. Now, I think Seneca would have liked this. I think Seneca thought of himself as a kind of therapeutical figure. Certainly the letters portray him in this. So he's, as you've said, Zibeta, this is very relevant and very current for people.
Yes, but I think the difference maybe is that in the States, Seneca is, I mean, he's not popular among classicists anymore. I mean, in the classic department, you don't find a Senecan revival right now. You see it on the YouTube mostly, and on this popular level. In Poland, I think there are people interested in Stoicism as a way of life, but they are watching English English YouTube videos.
Yeah.
So
this is interesting though, because there's literature has one life in the university, but it has another life in society. And Seneca was kicked out of the university, but he stayed alive in society at large.
Yeah, but I was going to say that what I find interesting is that in Poland there is a very strong presence of Seneca in academia, which is a bit surprising to me when I'm thinking about the Anglo-Saxon world. So we have, I mean, in Poznań, Elżbieta started to translate Seneca. I don't know exactly how many years ago, but so in Poznań there was
many.
Yeah. I didn't want to suggest this, but and then now we have another attempt to translate Seneca in Katowice. That's right. And my small contribution from Poznań as well. So I think it's a bit different. I don't know the reason, but Polish classicists, professional classicists, are much more interested in Seneca than the classicists in the UK or the States.
Yeah. Can I offer a speculation? And please forgive me if I'm offending anybody in saying this. Poland has had a tragic modern history. The great wars have been fought in Poland. There's been a succession of totalitarian governments, and I think the reality of Polish society has made Seneca's vision more tangible. America has had a very soft modern history. I mean, this is, America is a very soft country. There's been no war fought on American soil, for 170 years. And so for us, we don't have the forces of history, in a sense, reminding us of the relevance of Stoicism.
Yeah, that's quite possible.
Well, that's an interesting explanation. Yeah.
I mean, interesting in America, it's become part of the men's movement. It's these men saying, our tragic history is that feminists are mean to us. We don't have the Nazis. We don't have the Nazis. Yeah, we don't have the Nazis and Soviets fighting wars and our thing. We don't have starvation. We don't have, all of these things. We've been psychically bruised by women. So now that's not to say that there's not relevance to this, but I do think it's curious, that these are men trying to reconnect with their masculinity, through Seneca. And that's that's America as this slightly, and I'm a very patriotic American, please don't get me wrong, but it's, America is becoming a decadent country. This is a kind of decadent response to social trends. And I think Seneca is a good tonic. I think it will help these men in many ways that they don't expect to read and study Seneca. But it's I would frame it
a bit differently.
The situation of modern Polish history, modern Polish culture.
Yeah, because I think it's what you say is important in a different way, in the sense that I think in Poland we have this not to such an extent as in the States, but people, especially young people, are getting more and more vulnerable, even though their external situation isn't very hard. But Seneca is a poet who confronts you with the darkest aspects of human existence. And I think people on some level, maybe unconsciously, they want that. So people want heroism, but also they want to see real villains punished, for instance. They want to see real tyrants and real heroes acting against those tyrants. They don't want to be kept in this luxurious cage and protected from reality. So I think Seneca is therapeutic in the sense that Seneca tells you, life is very hard and painful and horrible, and we as humans are really evil, but there is also some good in this world, and there is capacity for good in humans. So I think you may be right that people are sort of craving for Seneca as for a glass of water in a desert.
I should say that with respect to some of the people I know, or people I have met who have just been attracted randomly to Seneca, there's a high proportion of medical students among them. In fact, if I would stereotype modern readers of Seneca in America, I would say medical students and soldiers.
Yeah, I would say soldiers too. I mean, the kind of, there's a sort of an American who's a very bright, college-educated American who goes in the military. I don't know if this happens in Poland. They'll drop out of Harvard or Yale, and I think it's because they want some, they want some deep experience. But they read Seneca. They're Stoics. They describe themselves as Stoic. They quote Marcus Aurelius. So it is true. But I don't know if you're all aware, American intellectuals and artists are fascinated with Poland because we see it as the Eastern European country that is most open to our understanding. And I think it's because you were one half in the West. You have the Latin, Catholic heritage as well as the Eastern European identity. So we have a profound response to Polish thinkers, Polish poets, that it's more difficult for us to have with, let's say, Bulgarians or even Russians in some ways. And so you occupy a very important place in our imagination.
Okay, and Seneca is the bridge between those two imaginations.
One of many.
Yeah, one of many.
May I?
Yes, Piotr, go ahead.
Unfortunately, I am medievalist, but I'm focused on theater. That's why my question is rather technical, because I know how many obstacles are to found when we try to adapt the older repertoire to contemporary audience. Of course, this is also a special audience like scholars of older theater, but for me it is very interesting. Have you, and this is special question to address to both, but special to our American host, have you any idea in mind before you have stage or compose for staging this this translation, special idea of chosen audience, yes.
Well, we did not have what you might think of as a special directorial concept of, this is going to be this kind of motivation or whatever. But the primary directorial idea we had was that when people came into the theater, we wanted them to experience the foreignness of this play rather than the familiarity of it. We did not want it to seem in any way like Ibsen or Chekhov or Tennessee Williams. We wanted them to feel they were looking into an ancient culture, a different way of telling stories, a different way of acting. And so we wanted ritual elements. We wanted to make it to make it seem alien and primal in a weird way. And it worked. People got that immediately. And so they didn't worry about this, the worst thing you can do is to have Juno doing her monologue with stage business. She goes over and pours herself a glass of water, or she lights a cigarette. And a lot of directors, I've worked with a lot of directors on other projects, and they always want, to add that concept. We wanted to make it weird. We wanted to make it foreign. We wanted to make it strange. And people responded to it. They liked it. It was like going into a foreign country for them.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not a theater person, which is certainly a weakness of my translation. But I certainly hope that if it's staged, the actors would be fully dressed. That was my minimal expectation. Because of course there is this tendency in modern theater to make it weird in a different sense,
Yeah.
right? So to make it modern in the hope that otherwise people will not be interested. I don't understand fully the psychology of this, but I think the play is weird enough that you can have people with their clothes on and not smoking cigars or not using gun machines or things like that.
No, it's so strange. I'm not sure if the title is the same in Polish, but Jan Kot's work, Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. I loved his notion about staging Hamlet as Elsinore is a city full of spies. Everybody is spying on everybody else. Everybody is reporting on everybody else. And I think a single idea like that would be extremely useful for Hercules Furens. I think if you sort of came, and it may be an idea, like the ones we talked about, which is the psychoanalytic, a dark, perspective of it. I don't know what the idea is because I'm not a great director like Kot, but it could be. I think a single idea like that you could unify it would be good, but still, I think it needs to be played as something from another world. And the good thing about this is that even today, I mean, there's a movie coming out about Seneca. I don't know if you I'm sure you know about this. There's a movie called Seneca that is just aired at Cannes, I think, with John Malkovich. But we still know Rome. We can still visualize Rome. We can still feel Rome. We still know who Nero was. We still know who the Caesars were. So, I think you have an advantage that you wouldn't have if it were Timur the Great or, somebody like this. And so I would love to do it again with a very powerful but very pure director, not a person that's doing lots of little things. I write a lot of opera librettos, and I can't begin to tell you how terrible some of these directors are. I mean, they have no respect for anything. They're just doing stuff to call attention to themselves. In fact, I told a major opera company that I would never allow this work I had done with this composer ever to be done there again because they had been so disrespectful, of the text.
And I think also disrespectful of the human voice, which is powerful in and of itself. You look at the French or the Italian tradition, the French or Spanish traditions in particular of drama, and you can get away with 2 or 3 actors on the stage speaking for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and that suffices.
Yeah, to do Seneca in English, you need trained voices. You cannot take these people that have done the Stanislavski method and just come there and mumble their lines. Marlon Brando would not have been a good Hercules. And you need people that are trained in diction and in eloquence, because the language is the star. Now, I had a Hercules who was very good at body language. He would, he could portray madness and things like that, but he delivered every line. You could understand every word he spoke. And that's essential. And that's not true for many American actors who have been trained in different traditions. You know, they've been trained that the language is the least important thing.
I think in Poland there is a similar problem with the younger generation of actors, that the diction and the sense of musicality of poetry is rarely to be seen in theater, unfortunately. But with Seneca, you just desperately need this. This is something that has to be there.
It's like opera. You know, opera, you need a singer who can hit every note, who can stay in tune. And so you need people that, and there's a certain kind of, you know, so you need, it tends to be people that do Shakespeare, who do classical drama. A lot of them have been trained in England, you know, where voice training is much more important than in America. You know, but you see, you know, a lot of times in America, there's a thing where they'll have a very famous movie actor who wants to demonstrate his or her seriousness. So they do a classic play, and it's usually a disaster because they just don't know what to do with the language. You know, they come out on the stage, everybody applauds, and then it's downhill from there. You know, I mean, I've walked out of, you know, productions of Hedda Gabler, of Richard III, and things like that because they're just too unbearable.
And it's often very, very famous actors as well.
It comes to a stage where everybody wants to do Shakespeare, but then you'll see somebody who does a great job, you know, and so that's wonderful because you realize that's what they did before they became famous.
Okay, does anyone else has a question or a comment? Oh, Eva, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yes, actually, yes, I have a small question. I hear today what was the source of inspiration for the inspiration, I mean the poetic tone of the English translation, but Mateusz was very shy to uncover his his source of inspiration for the poetic vision in his translation. I have a quite small question about the meter chosen by you. You decided to translate in 13 syllable lines and
hendecasyllables.
Yes,
in English, hendecasyllables. Yes.
Yes, so the hendecasyllables was for choirs, right? For the parts of chorus, and characters usually speak in 13 syllable lines. So I wanted to ask you, how did you get this idea? I have my own explanation, but I suspect I tried to find the answer for this question, and probably, I guess, I will tell you later.
Okay. That's a tricky question. Okay.
Yes. No, yeah. Just as a person who deals with flautists, it must be tricky.
Okay, thank you. Difficult question. I mean, as I repeatedly said, I'm not a poet, which was a way to defend myself as a translator, because I don't think highly of my poetic skills, but of course I think of them enough to attempt to do it. So I have to deal with that. So I chose the Polish Alexandrines, as it seems to be called. So 13 syllable Polish Alexandrines, which is a heroic meter in Polish poetry, right? I chose it for because well, maybe it was the wrong reason, but I thought that the hendecasyllables would be too short, because my goal was for my translation to have the same number of lines as the Latin version. Because if I extended the translation, then I could find a place for more things. But I decided that the number of lines in Latin and Polish will be the same. So then I tried hendecasyllables, I have to admit there is a version still in my computer, not deleted, but it was too difficult. Maybe it's not a good explanation, but I think I failed to. I like the sound of hendecasyllable. I think it's more flowing and easygoing, more seamless than Polish Alexandrines. But I decided I cannot do it while retaining the same number of lines. So I thought the Polish Alexandrines would be good for their heroic quality. But then I must admit I'm totally unhappy about the decision with the choral odes because I don't think that hendecasyllables reflect the Latin meter and music. So I don't think it was the optimal decision. But still, I try to be as faithful to the content as possible, and I wanted to be as clear to a non-professional reader as possible. So I decided to do that, and now I'm very curious about your own hypothesis.
Yeah, I think that I thought the same, that Polish Alexandrine, it would be very useful for the scene with characters, because it has such a length which is proper for discussion, for dialogues. And I would do the same if I were a translator of Seneca. And this is the first reason. The second one, that this is the most popular in Polish poetry meter, usually connected in our memory with heroic poems, just like Pantadeusz by Adam Mickiewicz. So it's clear that we usually use this meter. And of course, in the history of translation, of Polish translation of ancient literature, we have probably, I think, 9 times for 10, this meter is used by translators. So I think that this is the basic meter for translators. And I thought about this hendecasyllabus, although it looks in Polish completely different than in Latin. But probably we all remember the discussion after publishing translation of Aeneis by Kubiak. He used this meter, and we all decided that we all were sure that this meter is too short for epic poetry. But we know that the parts sung by choir usually are shorter. The line is just in graphic view, we see that it must be translated in another meter. And I thought that it's the second, the most popular meter is 11 syllable line. So it also was clear, and I think that it was very good decision that you decided to use the second different meter to make a difference between the parts which are spoken by characters and this which are the sung by choir, by choral. So I think that that it fits. It gives a good vision what we could expect in the Latin text, in the original text. Although we all know that differences are, there are so many differences that we can't say the equal sign between the Latin text and Polish translation. But but reading this text, I thought that I would do the same decision concerning the decision of meters. So may I congratulate you for this?
Thank you. Good to hear. Well, I was considering for the I like the idea that Dana had about trying different traditional meters for choral odes, just to make them sound different than the conversations between the protagonists. Tried even a shorter meter with 8 syllables, so tadam 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 tadam, but it was too not serious enough. Not serious.
I will tell you why it's not serious enough. Because this is the basic meter for Alexander Fredro. It's
yes,
loved meter. So everything in Polish language written or spoken in this meter sounds just like a comedy.
It sounds a bit common.
The most famous
why the hecadecillables is pam pa ta tam 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 pa ta pa tam tam pam pa ta tam 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 pa ta pa tam tam. So it's maybe too close to speech at times, but it can be it can sound like poetry in Poland. So I think hecadecillables are, and they have of course a tradition, a romantic tradition as well. But I think that the Polish Alexandrines are the equivalent of blank verse, which Dana chose. So the non-rhymed iambic pentameter. So this evokes the whole history of poetry in both languages. Okay, we have to wrap up our meeting, which is already beyond the expected time. So I just want to thank Dana especially for being here on Zoom with us and sharing his experience with translating this play. I want to thank Jaspreet for being here and coordinating our conversation, even though we tried to exclude you from it, but you bore this very patiently as usually. And I want to thank the audience for your participation, discussion. I'm very glad that we could have this conversation about Seneca.
And I'd like to thank all of you for the great kindness and courtesy of having this conversation in English, which allowed me to participate. That was very, very generous of you all.
You're welcome. Okay, so thank you all, and that's it. Have a good day or evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.